Lovely. We now move to the environment Q&A session, and I'd like to introduce my panel, of course. Stephen Williams, the Minister for Communities and the MP for Bristol West. Next to him is Ed Davey, of course, the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, and the MP for Kingston and Surbiton. To his left is Kate Parmenter, the Lord's spokesperson on the environment, and then Martin Harper. Welcome, Martin, who's the Conservation Director for RSPB. Thank you very much indeed. I would explain there was going to be an extra seat on the platform this morning, and that was Susan Kramer, who's our Transport Minister, but unfortunately she's completely lost her voice, so she's there listening somewhere as opposed to being able to speak. I apologise for that. So we've had a number of questions that were submitted, and I'd like to start, if I may, with a combination of two questions. The first is from Neil Stockley, who's a member of the Croydon Party. His question is, does our proposed national programme to insulate homes to reduce energy bills include targets to retrofit 1 million homes a year for those on low incomes? I'd also like to ask, the second part of his question is, what about energy efficiency for new homes? I'd like to combine that with a question from Martha Vickers of Newbury, and she's a Newbury Town Councillor. And she says, we need more housing urgently. We're committed to zero carbon buildings. Can you reassure us that urgency will not mean poor standards? So the first person I'd like to ask that of is Ed Davey, if I may.
Well, if I can take that last question first. I mean, you heard at the Conservative Party conference that they want to increase building by reducing energy efficiency standards. I think that is a ludicrous policy. We wouldn't do that. I think it's absolutely vital that we have high energy efficiency standards for all new homes, because that is cheaper in the long run and also is what people want. So we would be completely against that approach. In terms of energy efficiency more broadly, in the pre-manifesto, we talk about making energy efficiency part of the National Infrastructure Plan. At the moment, we have roads, energy, telecoms, and so on in the National Infrastructure Plan, but energy efficiency isn't there. But energy efficiency, in terms of reducing demand, is in many ways better than building new supply. And given that building new supply is part of the infrastructure programme, it's absolutely logical that energy efficiency should be part of the infrastructure programme, and that's what we're saying in the pre-manifesto. And then linking that, as Neil wants to do, to fuel poverty, I think we actually have a better approach, which we're actually delivering in government. We've got some new targets to ensure that the homes of the fuel poor, their energy efficiency is brought up radically, because we need to both measure fuel poverty more accurately, but also make sure the homes, in terms of the energy efficiency of the homes, they are brought up. So we have introduced, and it's going into law, a new standard that by 2030, all the homes, every single home where there's someone in fuel poverty, needs to be at least as far as reasonably practical, at C in terms of the energy performance certificate banding. That would make a dramatic difference. It would cut some people's fuel bills by well over £1,000. Of course, when you have a long-term target, like we all do in the climate change world, and you need interim targets as well. As you know, with the Climate Change Act, we've got a 2050 target, and we have 5-year rolling carbon budgets. Well, we've taken the same approach in tackling fuel poverty. So we have the legal standard for 2030, which I think is a pretty ambitious standard. I can tell you the Conservatives didn't want that standard. In fact, they didn't want any fuel poverty targets, is the actual truth. But we've negotiated interim targets for 2020 and 2025, bringing up the homes of the fuel poor to E by 2020 and D by 2025. So that, I think, is a really extensive programme, which fits in very well with our energy efficiency approach overall.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Stephen to answer the second part of that question because of your connection with the housing side of things. Can I just, in the meantime, if Neil or Martha would like to ask us, if they'd like to ask a supplementary question, could I ask them to go to the microphone in the auditorium, and they'll have the opportunity to do that?
Well, to Neil and Martha and to everyone else, tightening up building standards is actually an incredibly important contribution to reducing our carbon footprint, because the biggest contribution to greenhouse gases actually comes from our own homes. In government, we've already got an incredibly strong record on this. In 2011 and in April this year, we tightened up the building regulations. So new houses that get planning permission after those dates already have to be built to quite exacting environmental standards in terms of the glazing, the wall insulation, and the most energy efficient boiler. But we wanted to go further than that. So the most recent announcement I've made is that we're going to have zero carbon homes from 2016, which has been something that's been talked about for quite a long time. In this process, I've met some people from environmental organizations and from house builders who first started talking about this way back in 2007. So it's taken nearly 7 years to get possibly a Liberal Democrat minister in government to actually negotiate this, get it into the Queen's speech, and now for it to start its journey through Parliament. And what that will mean from 2016 is that houses will have to be built to even more exacting standards. So there'll be triple glazing, stronger wall insulation, more energy efficient boilers, and also some energy generation on site as well. And if a house builder isn't able to do everything on site, they'll be able to pay into funds called allowable solutions in the jargon. And I'm determined that allowable solutions opportunity will be as wide as possible, as many for house builders and planning committees to have a look at, ranging from a national fund, for instance, a contribution into the Green Investment Bank, all the way through to actually possibly paying for the retrofitting of older housing stock as well, maybe paying for a network of electric car charging points in the community. So the allowable solutions regime will be a great opportunity for low carbon business in Britain.
Thank you. Martin, you indicated you want to speak.
Thank you, Tessa, and thank you very much for...
Can you pass that along? Swap.
Thank you, Tessa, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join your august panel. First thing I'd like to say is that looking up there at your strapline, stronger economy, fairer society, I noticed there's a big gap. It could say healthy environment, and I challenge those who are developing the livery for next conference to think that through. I welcome the answers around the need for good standards for new housing. We do have a housing crisis. I would also encourage you to think about the location of that new housing. At the moment, down in Medway, in Kent, there is a proposal for developing 5,000 new houses on public land. Medway Council is giving outline planning permission for those houses. Unfortunately, that land happens to be one of our finest sites for nightingales, important for grassland and woodland. If that proposal goes through, and if it is okay for 5,000 houses to destroy triple size, that would set a terrible precedent for how we go about meeting our housing need in the future. And if, for example, the Liberal Democrat challenge of building 300,000 new homes a year was accepted, and if all of that every 5,000 block of houses was built on a triple SI, that would mean we would lose 60 of our finest wildlife sites a year, and that cannot be tolerated. So please, when you're thinking about standards, also think about location.
Thank you. I can see Neil Stockley standing by a microphone. Neil.
Yeah, I can see you too, Tessa. I'd like to thank Ed and Stephen for their answers, and I agreed with what he had to say. I would just like to ask him, though, is he confident that the current approach he's outlined will be enough to improve the insulation performance in the domestic building sector to the extent that we'll be able to achieve our carbon budgets and our proposed carbon budgets?
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, the answer I gave to your question was focused on the fuel poor, and we've obviously been working with the Fuel Poverty Advisory Group to get that strategy right. Your follow-up question is more broadly for the whole economy, as I understand it.
Yeah,
because
I mean, both questions in regard to the whole economy, actually.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the whole economy, in order to meet what we need to do in the fourth carbon budget, which is the amount of carbon Britain can emit between 2023 and 2027, we've still got to take some extra measures. And the most cost-effective ones will almost certainly be in energy efficiency. So I think the extra effort that we need to do for meeting our carbon targets, energy efficiency is right at the top of the list. And one of the issues that, despite the very big successes of Stephen Williams and before him Dom Foster and Andrew Stunnell on what they've done in DCLG, I think they'd be the first to admit that their Secretary of State has not been the greatest proponent of regulations to help energy efficiency. And if you look at the pre-manifesto, we propose 5 green laws. One of them is on renewable heat and energy efficiency, basically around buildings. And I would imagine that in that we would proceed with some of the energy efficiency regulations we've not been able to do because the Tories have stopped us. And indeed, some energy efficiency regulations that the industry wants us to take. So at the moment, for example, we have a consultation that's just ended on improving the energy efficiency in the private rented sector, where there's disproportionately amount of fuel poverty. Just getting that consultation out was difficult because the Tories didn't even want us to consult on whether we should have regulations in the private rented sector. But we've got that out and we want to press ahead, and those are the sorts of things that if we can push ahead in our manifesto, we'll actually get the support of tenants who would be in warmer homes, cheaper to run, environmentalist groups who would see us having the right policies to meet our carbon targets, and actually industry as well, because they want to see a clear set of standards that they can aim for.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to Neil and to Martha for their questions. I'd like to now move to another question from Victoria Charleston, who's a member of the Tower Hamlets Party. The question is, we know we're committed to fighting climate change, but there's a much stronger pitch in the pre-manifesto on the natural environment. What have ministers done and what's still to be done to protect our air, our water and our wildlife? Can I direct this initially to Kate, and then I'll come to you, Martin, if I may.
Thank you, Tessa. Well, our Green ministers have done a great job for our environment and our wildlife, and I'll just reel off a couple of the achievements. But for Liberal Democrats, we would not have had the really strong record that we now have on tackling illegal wildlife trade. But for Liberal Democrats, we wouldn't have the first ever government strategy on reducing the number of animals used in research and cutting down the suffering that's involved in that. And thanks very much to Norman for that. Without Liberal Democrats, we wouldn't now be having compulsory microchipping for dogs, which will encourage and help people to be responsible pet owners. But for the Liberal Democrats, we wouldn't be having this autumn a national pollinator strategy, which will help protect our vital bees and other insects which provide the food we need and help them against the appalling diseases, pests, and the pesticides, which are cutting numbers dramatically. So, and also, if I can say, I mean, we've got a panel here of some of our Westminster politicians, but for the Liberal Democrats in the European Parliament, like Chris Davis, we would not have, and also Catherine Bearder and others, we would not have had the success that we've had in reforming the common fisheries policies so that we have the fish that people need to eat in the future, but also the fish so that we have the necessary biodiversity in our marine environments. So we've achieved a lot, and that's great. And we can stand tall on that record when we go to the voters at the doorsteps in 2015. But I think it would be very fair to say that the manifesto in 2015 was very strong on climate change, but it was weaker on the natural environment and wildlife. I'm delighted that the Green ministers and pressure groups within the party, such as those who've worked hard on the Green Manifesto, has ensured that that weaker stance on the natural environment and wildlife has been rectified. And it's great. I mean, Ed talked about one of the 5 green laws. The one that I'm most passionate about is the commitment that if Liberal Democrats are in coalition government, within 2 years, there will be a Nature Act. There will be statutory targets for biodiversity, for clean air and water, and there will be a new statutory committee, the National Natural Capital Committee, which will be advising governments and helping them keep up to the marks. We've got, as I say, a great record on climate change. We need to make sure that we meet those targets to protect our resources for future generations as well. And can I also say that before we get to the election next year, and we can put those really important policies to the electorate, there's one more thing that I think Liberal Democrats need to be doing, and we will be doing, and that's ensuring that we get the implementation of the plastic bag charge, the 5p charge, making sure that people can see something tangible that we are doing to bring down the number of plastic bags, which are such a threat to our wildlife, that cause a huge carbon emission targets to be even increased even more, and that we are ensuring that the money from those plastic bags is not being sent back to the Treasury. It is being sent into local communities to help them with local environmental projects, local food projects, local educational projects. And that is really great news. So I think we've got a record of action and a promise of more.
Thank you, Kate. Can I just, before I go to Martin, I'm going to ask Victoria if she'd like to ask a supplementary question. She's welcome to go to the microphone in the auditorium. Martin.
Well, the first thing I must do, of course, is to thank Liberal Democrats and to conference for voting through the amendments on the pre-manifesto paper to include the Nature Act with strong targets for biodiversity and indeed to establish the Natural Capital Committee on a firm foundation. That is exactly the sort of response we want from political parties, and we're delighted that one party, the Liberal Democrats, has taken a lead, and we look forward to the responses from the other parties. So thank you very much for all your efforts. In terms of context for the need for action, I think it's a great question. The RSPB and 24 other organisations produced our State of Nature report last year, and that documented that in my lifetime, I was born in 1970, in my lifetime, we'd lost 60% of species for which we have data to be able to detect a trend. 60% have declined. And indeed, last week, WWF produced a report which demonstrated that half of the world's wildlife has been lost again in my lifetime. It makes me feel pretty guilty and pretty responsible for what happens next, and that is one of the motivating factors for me. But when it comes to the threats, they're huge, big, and quite scary. We refer to them as the four horsemen of the ecological apocalypse: habitat destruction, overexploitation, pollution, the worst being, of course, climate change, and the introduction of non-native invasive species. It is not possible to deal with the crisis facing our wildlife, and indeed the world's wildlife, with some timid proposal. It needs, if I might say, using Ed's phrase from yesterday, it needs disruptive insurgents, likes of Liberal Democrats, hopefully from with the other parties as well, to shake up the system. It was great when the current coalition government produced a natural environment white paper and said that it wanted to be the first generation to pass on the natural environment in an enhanced state. That is absolutely the right ambition. And unfortunately, notwithstanding the good progress that has been made, and I'm not here to determine who claims the credit for that, despite the progress that has been made, there is a massive mismatch between ambition and delivery. There is a huge shortage in resources to deliver the sort of scale of investment required to recover our wildlife. The global commitments which this government signed up to suggested about a sixth of our land surface should be managed primarily for nature and to be in good condition, and the rest of the land should be managed more to be more accessible to wildlife. We're way off that at the moment. And if I may, if there's one challenge I would ask you as a party to consider is, what is your future ambition for food and farming? Food and farming currently, the whole of that system is broken. We know that. It doesn't just affect wildlife, it affects also our health. A third of our under 18-year-olds currently are overweight or obese. And also there's real poverty here as well. 25% of our farmers are currently in poverty. And again, I was shocked to hear that the Trussell Trust last year had to give emergency food on 913,000 occasions to deal with people who are now in food poverty. That food system is broken, and I look forward to the day when the Liberal Democrats has a very radical policy on the future of food and farming. And if I may, that's the challenge I'd like to leave you with today.
Thank you. Thank you. We have no supplementary question to that, so I'd like to thank Victoria for her question. And if I may, I'll move now to Councillor Simon Morneau, who's a Tandridge Party chair and one of our district councillors. Simon asks, as the party which champions environmental protection and renewable energy, why are we supporting fracking, which will scar our landscapes and increase greenhouse gas emissions?
I understand there's a lot of concern in the party. Let me just talk through why I think we shouldn't reject the option of shale gas. We don't know whether we will be able to get shale gas in a commercially viable way yet, because we're still at very early stages. But I think it would be wrong to turn our backs on it. It's for this. In our carbon plan, which we published to meet our carbon budgets, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% at least by 2050, hopefully more ambitious still, that shows us using an awful lot of gas in the next 20, 30 years, because the vast majority of gas we use is to heat our homes. And replacing gas heating of our homes by renewable heat is going to take some time. And actually, you talk to all the green groups, they accept we're going to be using a lot of gas, because it's coal that's the climate destroyer, and we've got to get rid of much more quickly. So then you're left with the question, where's the gas going to come from? We're increasingly importing a lot more gas. Our North Sea gas production is falling. A lot of our gas, our marginal supply of gas now, comes from Qatar. They liquefy it, they put it on ships. The ships sail around the Straits of Hormuz, heard of them? And then comes to the UK, and then it's taken from liquid back to gas. That uses a lot more energy, and the carbon footprint of that LNG gas is much greater than using shale gas in the UK. Much greater. And the thing we've got to be really careful about, which I've insisted on and Chris Huhne did before me, is a very robust regulatory regime on all aspects of the environment, particularly on things like methane emissions, because oil and gas exploration, whether it's onshore or offshore in the North Sea, if it's not regulated properly, there are other greenhouse gases that are emitted, particularly methane. So you have to regulate them really, really tightly. But if you do that, actually, shale gas could help us meet our greenhouse gas targets, because it's got a lower footprint. Gas is a transition as we bring on these new green technologies, and we're doing incredibly well on that. I understand that people are worried in particular areas, but we protected, Liberal Democrats have protected, national parks, areas of outstanding beauty, World Heritage Sites. That wasn't on the agenda till we put it on there. Moreover, we've ensured that local planning authorities have the key decision role, and that central government can't overrule that local democratic element. So we've got lots of protections in there, as exactly should be. We've not gone down the American route, I can absolutely assure you.
Okay, I'm not sure whether Simon's in the room and he'd like to ask a supplementary question. He's welcome to go to the microphone. Does anybody else want to say anything? Yes.
I'd like to hear the answers from the other panellists.
Of course.
Well, very briefly, if I may. I think that it's fair to say that what we're wanting is an energy future which is absolutely consistent with our low carbon trajectory. And I think it is a contested area at best to say that an investment in fracking will be in meeting with our climate targets. On the desire for a world-class regulatory regime, I welcome your words, Secretary of State. I think that when the RSPB, National Trust and other organisations came together producing our Are We Fit for Frack document, we pulled together the evidence which we had from across the world, particularly in America. And I have to say the evidence was pretty light about what the nature of the impacts are, which is absolutely why we need a really strong regulatory regime which acts in a precautionary way. And of course, we welcome the exclusion of national parks, of ANBs and World Heritage Sites. I would say from a wildlife organisation that it seems a bit odd not to exclude our sites of European importance and indeed our SSSIs from that list. And so I'd encourage you to consider that as the proposal develops. But the bottom line is, unless there is a world-class regulatory regime in place, I don't think that communities across this country will put up with fracking.
Thank you. Simon, have you a supplementary question?
Well, just the observation as a local councillor for many, many years that, and I'm in Surrey, the North Downs, Sussex has been very much in the news for fracking. I think it's cloud cuckoo land to think that local authorities will pass these applications. They will face massive opposition from the localities. So if the promise is there that if the localities don't want it, they won't get it, then you won't get it.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you for your question. If I may, I'll move now to Tim Bearder. Tim, if you have a supplementary, please don't hesitate to go to the microphone. I'll ask you a question first. Why did you choose to put tax breaks on council tax rather than VAT for energy-saving products like boilers or insulation? Who'd like to take that one?
Well, I presume he meant not VAT on them, but taking
No.
VAT off.
I think that's probably what he
I
did
think
mean,
that's,
yes.
what he meant. Well, we do have a reduced VAT rate for energy-saving materials. It's being contested by the European Commission at the moment, and we may not be able to keep the lower VAT rate we've got at the moment. So we're obviously we're contesting back, not accepting the European Commission's argument. So it's a bit of a complicated area. I personally think the council tax is a better way, A, because it's linked to the property that you are making more energy efficient. So should you move, having invested in that property, the council tax discount stays with the property for those people who are going to be living there, and that will be a good selling pitch for the home mover. And we will, before the next election, finalise the exact amount. At the moment, we're saying it's at least £100 off your council tax bill every year for 10 years if you improve the energy performance of your property by 2 EPC bands. That's the most radical policy in terms of a tax incentive for energy efficiency Britain will have ever seen. And it will mean people who, in their focuses and on the doorstep, can knock on the door and say, we want to give you a double bill cut. Permanently cut your energy bill, and we'll give you a 10-year cut of at least £100 in the council tax. I think this is a really popular campaigning issue, colleagues, and I hope people will use it.
Thank you. Stephen, did you just quickly?
Just one thing to add. Obviously, hopefully that measure will be both popular and, more importantly, effective. But a lot of the people who are in fuel poverty because they live in poorly insulated homes, of course, are not council taxpayers. So in the whole mix of what we do in this area, we must not forget that. Council tax is broadly a regressive tax, but some people in the poorest households will not be council taxpayers. So we must make sure that any fiscal regime that we put in place bears that in mind to make sure that people who are in fuel poverty also get all the help that they need.
Can I reassure people on that? The energy company obligation, which is a legal obligation we put on major energy suppliers to invest in energy efficiency in their customers' homes, the Conservatives wanted to cut back on that, and the part that was for fuel poverty was really under attack. I said we will not cut the investment in fuel poverty £1, and we didn't, despite what the Conservatives wanted.
Thank you. Do you want to ask a supplementary question?
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank Ed and urge him to continue the fight with Europe and make sure that we do get some tax incentives on energy-saving products. But I just wonder if he thinks that maybe the council tax thing is a disincentive to landlords, private landlords, to do energy reforms.
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think, and the party thinks, we should use regulations on the private renter sector. We've got a set of regulations that have been out, or a set of proposals for new regulations out to consultation. That's now finished. It's had a very positive response, and we'll be responding ourselves formally as a government to that. And those regulations effectively say you would not be able to let out your property to a tenant in a few years' time unless you had brought the energy efficiency standard of that property up to a minimum. That would both reduce carbon emissions, it would ensure that tenants have warm homes and lower energy bills, and I think the regulatory approach in the private renter sector is definitely the way to go.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Tim, for your question. I'd like to now move to a question from Dr. Brian Matthew, who's from the North Wiltshire Party, and he's our parliamentary candidate in North Wiltshire. If Brian could go to the supplementary mic, that would be handy if he wants to ask another question. His plea is that we should have a green thread showing clearly through all our green policies in the manifesto. He says, we are the real Green Party, we're in government. How can we show it?
Well,
Yes.
well
Do you want
I
to
mean, the proposal for 5 green laws, I think, is the most radical green position a mainstream party's ever taken. And if you've not read the pre-manifesto, I'm sure you've all read it word for word. The 5 green laws are 1 for a zero carbon Britain, 1 on renewable heat and energy efficiency, 1 on green transport, 1 on zero waste, and the nature bill. It's far more comprehensive than I think we did at the last general election. So I think we've really stepped up our game, covering areas that we were, frankly, a bit too weak on in our 2010 manifesto. So I do think, I mean, open to challenge from others, but I do think we've now got the greenest set of policies we've ever done. And what we've said to the green NGOs and all stakeholders about our 5 green laws, we've got the overall outline of what we'd like to see, but we want to work with them from the pre-manifesto to the manifesto so they become even stronger.
Kate.
Yes, can I just add a sort of supplementary to that? Because I think, as I said, I agree with Ed. I think the manifesto pitch for 2015 is much, much stronger than it was in 2010. We're talking about targets, we're talking about statutory committees, we're talking about a whole range of environmental and wildlife issues which will be to the benefit of our country, of Europe, and more broadly globally. But I think we also, as Liberal Democrats, have to face the challenge, and this is where I think the environmental groups between now and the manifesto need to help all the political parties, which is we're passionate about the environment. We care about it. It's in our DNA. That's why we've got the policies. But we've got to communicate that to the people on the doorsteps. And for me, it's about, I mean, the 5 green laws is great, but we need some policies which meet the doorstep challenge. Yep. And that's why I'm so proud of the fact that we are delivering on the plastic bag charge, and why we are also promising 750,000 trees, 1 for every child in the country, so that people on the doorstep can get a sense of what are the values that drive Liberal Democrats. Because we can sit here on this platform and you can ask us questions about, you know, common agricultural policy modulation, about contracts for difference, about natural issues, national committees, and that's great, and we all know what we're talking about, but for the people on the street, we've got to reconnect what we need to do as a country with what matters to them. And so I think I'm really pleased, and I know Ed had a lot to do with this, so hats off Ed, of coming up with the 5 green laws, which says this is what we'll do within 2 years if we're part of the next coalition, but we need other policies like plastic bags, like a tree for every child, which show people on the doorstep simply where we're coming from, what we believe in, and the direction of travel that they'll get from the Liberal Democrats.
I mean, I really welcome those words, Kate. I think that it is sometimes actually quite difficult to get people to tap into their latent concerns about wildlife and to make the case through the ballot box. And, you know, we're trying at the moment. We've got a new campaign. We call it our Vote for Bob campaign. It's a little fluffy red squirrel. And the intention is to try and say, if you love nature, then call upon your political parties to make sure they've got strong action for nature in their manifestos. You've already, you know, set the standard in many ways. But I think also we are looking for personal commitment. So when you as prospective politicians go to the doorstep of voters, I hope they ask you, what are you personally going to do for nature? I have to say, our chairman today, Tessa, she happens to be the species champion for Bittern, which I have to say, she's backed a winning horse. I hope as many MPs as possible to start championing some of our most threatened wildlife. And Bittern, as many of you will know, it's a small, reclusive little heron associated with rebeds, went down to 11 booming males in 1997, and now, probably thanks to Tessa on her own, it's up to over 100 booming males, going back to places like Dungeness in Kent, going back to Otmoor in Oxfordshire. And that's the sort of commitment we want from our politicians, to stand up for those species that don't have a voice.
I have to say, it's fantastic that they're down on the Somerset levels. I shouldn't really interject like this, but they are down on the Somerset levels, and it's fantastic that you've taken the trouble and time to show me exactly what's happening and to repeat that experience so that I can go and see what's happening. They're great birds. Come to Somerset. Stephen?
One thing to add, one of the most important motions we passed this week was on Monday, when we set ourselves the incredibly demanding and exacting target of building 300,000 new homes every year for the next 10 years, from the next Parliament onwards. Some of you will be old enough to remember when housing was last such a huge issue in general elections back in the 1950s and 1960s, when Macmillan, Gaitskell, Wilson, and everyone competed on the number of units of housing that they could build. But at that stage, it was just a numbers game. There was absolutely no comprehension whatsoever of climate change and how people lived their lives in their homes, the energy they consumed, whether the new flats were leaky and so on. No thought really given to that at all. In the future, not only will we be building more homes in order to help solve the affordability crisis that people face these days, but they will be built to incredibly tough standards as well. So it's not just giving hope to young people that they can get on the housing ladder. It's not just building more purpose-built accommodation for elderly people that is fit for them in the last third of their life as well. But it's making sure that all of those new homes are built to tough standards so they are warm and comfortable to live in and people have lower bills as a result.
Lovely, thank you. Dr. Matthew.
Thank you very much, Tessa. It's great to have, I should start by saying it's great to have such a wonderful green team up there on the stage, so well done to all of you. I'm actually a chartered environmentalist, so I appreciate the need to get the policies right, but I also appreciate the need to get the message across. So, Kate, I take your points very, very clearly. My fear, though, and these are good points, but we have a lot of other green policies, and I really feel we've got to have a green thread that goes through the whole of the manifesto, showing just how green we are. Otherwise, flip the page, and suddenly it looks a bit like a sort of green window dressing. We've got to make sure we get our message across. The young people are, by and large, in favour of green policies, and so many of our members are too. So I really, really would like to push the point. We've got, like no other time before, to stress our green credentials in this very important upcoming election. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, very much indeed. We've got time for one quick question. Steve Bolter, if you could, if you want to ask a supplementary, it'll have to be a very, very brief one. But Steve's question, his original question was, is there strategic planning for new nuclear energy beyond Sizewell C? And is the use of thorium being considered for the UK?
Well, the new nuclear plans that are there would see new nuclear reactors at Sizewell C in Suffolk, at HPC, the Hinkley Point C in Somerset, replacing the nuclear reactor on Anglesey, replacing the nuclear reactor at Oldbury, and a nuclear reactor at Moorside. They're the ones that are in the nuclear plan. In terms of future nuclear technologies, there's quite a lot of R&D going on to a number of different areas. Thorium's one of them, but there's also technology called molten sodium, and there's a group of reactors called small modular reactors. It's important that we do this, because if we can make sure that the costs come down, that's going to be important. And because the threat of climate change is so significant that many environmentalists have changed their position on nuclear power, including myself. George Monbiot of The Guardian has changed his position. The founder of Greenpeace, who used to be probably the most vigorous campaigner against nuclear power, has changed his position because of the threat of climate change. So having this plan on nuclear power, which I know some people in the party aren't that keen on, but having that, coupled with research and development to new technologies to keep the costs as low as possible, I think is the right approach. But be clear, the electricity market reform that we put through is for all low-carbon technologies, and that's why we're seeing the huge growth of renewables. I'm really proud that we have more than double the amount of renewable electricity and more than double the amount of renewable electricity investment for the future. And we're a world leader in offshore wind, a world leader in tidal power, and we're seeing that growth. And it's some people's belief that the costs of many of these renewables, including wind and solar, will come down and be very competitive against nuclear. And in our electricity market reform, the future will be for the lowest cost low-carbon technology. And some of us believe that is likely to be renewables in the future. So I think it's right at these relatively early stages as we tackle climate change and decarbonise. We don't take any low-carbon technology off the table because of the threat of climate change. But if you look at the trends in the world, I think the trends in solar costs and wind costs are such that we can be pretty confident that renewable electricity is going to be one of the winning low-carbon technologies of the future.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave it there, if I may. I'm not going to, well, luckily Steve doesn't seem to be at the mic, and that's possibly because his question was one of those that was submitted online. I'd like to thank everybody who submitted questions. I haven't been able to have every one of those aired this afternoon, but I'd like to thank, if I may, Ed Davey, Stephen Williams, Kate Parmenter, Martin Harper, thank you. Susan Kramer in her absence, I'm sure she's thought about us and heard us. And I'd just encourage everybody to make the case for our green achievements and for our green future, and make sure that we actually show that green thread that's through all of our manifesto, as we have done for the last 30 years, really, in our ambitions for this country's future. Thank you very much indeed, conference. Lovely.